Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to the folks on the webinar. Here I am again. I'll get out of the way real fast. I just want to let you know what we're doing for the LSRPA and the LSRP membership. But before I do, I want to thank our sponsors. We have about 17 or 18 sponsors now. Here they are. I used to announce them one by one, but as you can see, we have a lot of them, and that's a good thing. And they got together today and bought us some pizza. So we're very appreciative of that. Please help yourself. There's about 85 pizzas back there that are extra. So take one each. Next slide, please. Okay, just to give you an idea of what is taking us into the new year. We just had our ethics training, by the way. We just brought in someone from Colorado who gave us a whole day's worth of ethical and unethical situations, and it provoked a lot of discussion, and we had a lot of good conversations there. That was on Monday this week, and next week another exam is coming up for the LSRP, so we're having a exam review course. The exam is on November 15th. Something very important for the LSRPs to consider attending on December the 5th. We're having a business practice seminar. We're going to talk about LSRP liability, insurance issues, contract language that you might want to put in your proposals. So I think that would be very important for you to put that on your calendar today. Reserve that day. It's going to be a half-day seminar on those things. Another review course will be coming on January 3rd because the fourth exam is coming up on the 17th of January. And on January 10th, the LSRPA has their annual meeting, which everybody is welcome. It's an open-door meeting, so you can attend. Now for 2013, we're planning some technical classes. The LSRPs have to accumulate continuing ed credits now. Every 3 years, they have to show at least 36 credit hours, and they have to also take credits, a certain number of credits in each of the categories as ethics, technical credits, and regulatory credits. And we're hoping that the department works with us to put on some of those regulatory courses so that the LSRPs can get the proper credit. The LSRPA itself is going to put on about 4 or 5 courses during the year, and of course there's other classes out there, Rutgers and NJIT and other institutions put courses on all the time. So that's what we're planning. Thank you very much. Please partake of all the pizza and soda back there. And this land use training, I think, is very important because I think we have sort of a disconnect between the site remediation program and the land use program, and this training should sort of meld the two. So listen carefully. That's my advice. Thanks very much.
I don't know if everybody knows Mark. Hi. How are we doing?
Good.
Good. Lovely. Wonderful. You'll notice, those of you who remember me when I was with SRP for about 15 years, when I give presentations, I usually don't hang at the podium. You're not supposed to look at me. You're supposed to look at the slides and the information that we discuss. I'd like to thank you, the LSRP Association, for allowing us to come and speak. I also would like to thank the Site Remediation Program. I'd like to thank the Site Remediation Program for also extending this invitation. And one of the things that Dan had touched on is some of the goals that I'm hoping that we will be able to convey in this meeting and sort of build upon in the years to come when dealing with the site remediation professionals and land use and coordinating our efforts more collectively together. Out of curiosity, with people in the audience, I know there's some DEP people in here, so you don't have to answer this. Who here is LSRP? Bruce. Just for those who are not in the audience but listening from home, that was Bruce Venner that raised his hand. Of the LSRPs, put your hands back up, please. Who has done land use permitting? Who has successfully accomplished land use permitting? Who personally was involved in the land use permitting and it wasn't an individual in your firm who had knowledge in it? Okay, we got it. I knew I could get there one of these days. Well, I've been the director over there for 2 years. I don't know you land use permitting yet, but I'm getting pretty good at it. One of the things I'm hoping in the goal of the presentation that I'll be giving, which will be a broad overview of what land use is, why we permit, sort of identifying our goals, will then be followed by Suzanne Dietrich, and we'll find out why Suzanne Dietrich with site remediation is going to talk about land use permitting, will be presenting. What I'm hoping in this presentation, if the goals of it, is one, to sort of stimulate some discussions, and yes, I will ask you to give questions, to increase your awareness of land use, sort of to increase cooperation between LSRPs and land use through the permitting process. And also, if you leave with nothing else from this meeting, then there'll be a couple points I'll make. But the biggest point is engage land use early on. One of the things I continually hear when I'm out doing presentations or I'm interacting with people, they say, oh, it's land use. Oh, here we go. There's going to be problems. Well, a lot of times that's because we're brought in at the end of the process. Many times it's with the redevelopment sites, but it's brought in after decisions are made, business plans are decided upon, engineering design's done, and then they come to land use permitting. Some of your companies that have land use groups within permitting units, you already know this and you do engage us. For those that don't, some of you single practitioners, you need to be aware of it and you need to be cognizant of it. So with that, Joe, please. These are basically 4 points of the goals of the land use regulation program. I think one thing that's interesting to know is these goals, when you're doing a remediation through site remediation or through SARA as an LSRP, you have goals too. We're basically the same goals for all intents and purposes, but there's a different perspective that's put on those goals. As you can see, one of the land use main goals is to protect waters, air, lands, natural and historic resources of the state, to ensure continued use, public benefit of those valuable resources, align with the department and state strategic and economic goals, and to protect the citizens of New Jersey. I think if you get to number 3, align with the department and state strategic economic goals, we recognize that land use has a part to play in redevelopment and economic redevelopment within the state, a very integral one. We also realize that many of the contaminated sites that you're dealing with are located in areas that historically were around water, were around rivers, streams, and those sites today still serve a great potential of a resource that can be redeveloped and put back to reuse. So we're in line with getting that. Next slide, please. I have a lower degree in mathematics, so I like the simple math equation there. Again, the point here is that together, site remediation and land use, when we work collectively, we also can ensure that the sites are cleaned up in a more timely fashion, and we can ensure that we're still protecting the resources that I'm charged with. And as an LSRP, because you also have the obligation to ensure what work you're doing is in accordance with all prevailing rules and regulations, you too have that charge. Oh, you already went to me. Yeah. This, I solely threw up there. No one ever could find an organization chart for land use regulation. You now have one. This is for my managers and up. I just sort of wanted to give you an overview of how this is set up. You have my office at the top, and then the division is broken into 2 groups. We have an administrative group over on the left here. Is there a pointer? And this administrative group has two basic bureaus underneath it, the Technical Services Bureau, and then also the Tidelands and Application Support. Technical Services, in land use, we aren't just a permitting group. We also have an E&T group that evaluates threatened and endangered species. We have a mitigation group that oversees and reviews mitigation plans that are being done on the various resources that are impacted, which is inevitable within cleanups and redevelopments of sites. We also have within this basically is the engine that does all the work and not a lot of people see. This makes all the information that we have available. This is my administrative support group that does everything that comes in, logs it into the systems, updates our NGEM systems, create the records in, that then allows us to have good information that we can make available to ourselves and to you and the regulated community. On this side, as you can see, I have an assistant director box. There isn't one. Currently, these groups report to me. Basically, we have four operable units within the division. One's sort of a hybrid, and that's where Suzanne comes in. You have coastal regulations under Dave Fance, who's my manager. He deals with everything from Mercer County, Monmouth County south. You then also have on this inland regulation, which is Rick Riley, that deals with everything from Mercer County, Monmouth north, including it. You also have Chris Jones, which deals with areas up around the Hudson waterfront, Atlantic City, and some special urban areas. Chris's group used to be involved in overseeing the remediation of contaminated sites and land use permitting. How long ago? February of 2011. I then got a new manager in the group, but not in the group. The reason this is a dotted line, that's Suzanne Dietrich. She's, as you may know, is with the Office of Sediment Dredging Technology. Got it? Oops. Yeah, whatever. We got to change that name. We really do. Got to get a land use permitting component in that. But Suzanne does not work for land use. Suzanne works for site remediation. Suzanne has experience in dredging and the site remediation program. She reports sort of as a dual report. She reports to Barry Frasco within site remediation, and she reports to me on land use permitting issues. What this has brought up is the learning curve for a person in land use trying to permit and understand the need for the impacts has been very greatly reduced by having her and her staff actively involved in the process, because they're coming in with a knowledge that many others within my division did not know. And this has worked out very well. At least that's what I hear. Next slide, please. Now, when I came over to land use, I thought it was tough over at SRP when we had, the tech regs, the oversight rules. What else did we have? We had ISRA, some of that. We had the US rules. Well, when I came over to land use, I found out there's a little more in land use, and it was difficult to understand, and I just want to touch on the various big parts of the statutes and regulations that we oversee in land use so you can understand why we do, or at least understand what it is we regulate and the basis for it. The first one is the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act. The Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act obviously deals with wetlands. Interesting enough, out of all of the states in the nation, New Jersey is one of two assumed programs that assume the federal freshwater wetlands permitting. So we also have a single permit in New Jersey for freshwater wetlands impacts, and there's a couple exceptions to that. But for overall is you come to New Jersey, we issue a permit, and that permit is honored by the federal government. You don't, in other states, you'll have to go to both, except for Michigan, if I'm not mistaken. That's the other one. The regulation, 77A, these regulations are probably going to be stakeholdered in the next year or so. Probably beginning of next year, we're going to start commencing some stakeholder discussions on looking at those rules and improving them. The next is, and by the way, these two, if you haven't had land use involvement, if you're around any water area, these are the two that you're probably going to deal with most of all. The next is the Flood Hazard Control Act. That deals with basically protection of those waters, the buffers and riparian zones around those, the flood hazard area, the areas that are inundated with water, and it regulates activities within those. It's to protect those resources, but it's also, interesting enough with the Flood Hazard Control Act, is to protect people. Not just the person who builds, but the person who would be affected by if what you build in those areas could adversely impact them and displace floodwaters. Next, please. The coastal area, or CAFRA, as it says, deals with the coastal areas. It deals with certain resources that are identified under that act and those regulations, but it also deals with ensuring that there is reasonable, and I'm trying to phrase this in a way, reasonable and responsible development within those areas that would minimize or try to mitigate the impacts on those resources. As you can see, you'll notice you have NJC 7:7 and 7:E. These rules are repeated because there's a few other acts I'm going to touch on that they're embodied in the same regulations. If you all know this, I can just jump through this and we can go home and have a party and speak of it. Okay. Waterfront Development Act. Basically, that act deals with overwater. Anything that's built, constructed over water, tidal waters, for all intents and purposes, is what the Waterfront Development Act deals with. And those, again, implementing regulations are embodying it in these citations. Next slide, please. Tidelands Act does not have any regulations. Tidelands Act is something that a lot of people don't think about. If you have an area that was flowed or formerly flowed by tidal waters within the state of New Jersey, the fundamental principle under this act is the public trust doctrine, that those resources that are flowed or have been flowed within the state of New Jersey are available to everyone and is property of the state of New Jersey. So there's instances where people will construct things over water, but they don't have the tidelands mechanism or the rights to do that because the land that they're constructing upon is not theirs. We have a group that oversees that within that administrative and tidelands group, if you remember on the organizational chart on the left side. So they deal with licenses, grants, and such. The Highlands Water Protection Act, probably one of the most specific acts I have read. Our regulations, and this deals with up in North Jersey, our regulations basically mirror the act. There's a lot of statutory mandates that are within that act, which is very interesting because a lot of the acts that we have were general in nature, outlined general concepts, but this went into a lot of detail. If you have it in the Highlands area, we'll talk about, there's ways that we, through Suzanne and other people within our office, can assist you. If you don't have a knowledge of it, you can't navigate through it. The Wetlands Act of 1970 basically protects our coastal wetlands. So we have the Freshwater Wetlands Act that deals with non-coastal wetlands, and the Wetlands Act of 1970 that deals with coastal wetlands. Next, please. We've undertaken a lot of, we have a whole team set up within Rob Peel's group, who's been working intimately with my staff and with Suzanne and other stakeholders going through and looking at our rules. Two rules that are going to be, I'm putting these tentative dates out. These are our targets of what we want to happen with these rules going out, are the coastal rules. Remember those rules that I said that there's 3 different acts that apply? Well, one of them, what we're doing is we're going to combine 7 and 7A, and we're going to turn it into one rule. As part of that, we also are going to look at, and again, for those of you that have dealt with land use, you can go to a different rule and it may have a different administrative requirement than this rule, and it's different than the administrative requirement in this rule. What we're trying to do as our overall rule revisions is try to align all of our administrative requirements to make them the same. One way to do public notice. I mean, it sounds silly, but it's very frustrating to a practitioner who has obligations in this rule and can't figure out what they are supposed to do. So that's one of the things. That sounds like a little thing, but I think as a practitioner, it's a big thing. We're also looking at some issues that we had identified through the permitting process where we had problems with it. And that doesn't mean we were asserting more jurisdiction. In many instances, we realized there were things that were contemplated in these rules that really wasn't the intent of the rules. And we've revised the rules to reflect that, making many things permit by rules, many things which would then be general permits from an individual permit. Who here knows the difference in land use about permit by rules, individual permits, and GPs, general permits? Who wants to know the difference that doesn't know it yet? Nice. I like it. Good interactive crowd. Somebody smile. Okay, permit by rules. The regulations, the land use regulations will outline certain activities that can be conducted that you do not need to come to the department on. As an LSRP, Suzanne's going to touch on it when she gets into some of her case studies, some activities that can be conducted without coming to land use. That doesn't mean you're not in a jurisdictional area. It just means you don't need a permit and you have it under regulations. There's then general permits. Now, what was different for me coming from SRP over to land use, my general permit concept in site remediation was slightly different than that of land use. Land use's general permits basically are what was an IP, an individual permit, and it happened all the time, and then we developed specific criteria that if you get a JP, you meet those specific criteria, you get it. You don't have to go through all of these other alternative analysis and requirements in our individual permit. So it's customized to fit what you would need. And Suzanne's going to touch on what GPs also are available for an LSRP to do investigation and remedial activities. An IP, usually if you're a practitioner and we say an IP, well, no, usually if you're the client paying the practitioner and we say an IP, and they're like, oh, no. An IP is a very extensive process, and it should be. It's where there's a resource that's being impacted and substantial, and you need to do a lot of detailed analysis, whether it's under the Flood Hazard Control Act, the Freshwater Wetlands Act, or CAFR rules, or any of the others. Flood hazard rules, similar to the coastal rules, we're aligning the administrative things consistent with what we're changing in coastal. We're going to change in flood hazard to make them all the same. We also, again, are looking at our rules. Under the flood hazard rules, we had the ability to issue hardship waivers. Well, we realized that if you keep approving a hardship waiver, you better look at that section of your rule, because if you feel it's all right to approve it, you probably need to change your rule, and that's what we did. Certain activities that we saw that were repeating, that we were granting, we were saying, why are we regulating this to this level and degree? Let's lessen it. Also, we did some additional GPs, pretty substantial amount of GPs that were individual permits, and a bunch of individual permits that now have been reverted to permits by rule. Next, please. Okay, SRP, LSRPs. Before, early. Again, what I'm trying to get to in the slide is for those of you that have individuals that are practitioners in land use, you know what to do. You know when to engage the department. For those of you that don't, and you're in a process of an investigation phase, and we're going to give you some tools in a little bit that you can use. But if you don't know the answers, you need to engage us. You need to identify what the resources are, which I'll touch on too. One of the important things that I've seen, at least in my mind, is in remedial selection. As an LSRP, you're going out and evaluating the site, you're delineating the extent of contamination, and you're recommending a remedial option to your client, I assume. During your remedial investigation phase, you probably have figured out what you're probably going to do. Well, when you have resources on the site, and it's truly contaminated, and you have to impact them, and say fill those resources, of course we will allow you to do that. We have permits to deal with that. But with that also comes a cost, because you need to mitigate for those impacts. And sometimes when you're talking to your clients and you're selecting remedial alternatives need to be incorporated into what land use obligations would be, because sometimes we'll select a remedy that we feel is more cost effective, but it's impacting a resource, and then the mitigation for that resource could be more expensive than an alternative remedy. And we'll tell you how we can help you through that process. The same lies true on the next two. Redevelopment, very challenging for an LSRP, especially when you have a client that wants to redevelop the site, maybe to expand the development that they want to do on that site to make it feasible for them. And I've had some instances, and maybe we'll get in some details in the case studies, where sometimes the LSRP is put in a position to go beyond the extent of what truly the contamination is, to say this is needed to be impacted. And what we end up doing, and Suzanne will touch on it, or what Suzanne will do when we get these in and we identify that, hey, you know what, maybe this remedy is too far. Maybe it's a little too much. Maybe the contamination doesn't warrant the level of impacts that are happening. She'll most likely refer it over for a component review. For someone over at site remediation who can spend the time to go through that review to see if it's really necessary. And if they tell us it's necessary, we'll do the permitting. Identify resources in jurisdictional areas. I'm going to touch on that in a second. Next slide, please. Just looking at the time. Oh, Ed Putnam's here. Hi, Ed. Nice to see you. No, please, feel free. You got to smile. You got to have fun. Let's see. What's available? I'm going to touch on jurisdictional and applicability determinations. I'm going to just touch on pre-app meetings, and then I want to spend a little bit on a website that I'm pretty excited about because I'm not IT smart, and we did something I think that's really cool. It's not the answer, but it's a heck of a good start. Next slide, please. Jurisdictional determination, freshwater wetlands. Basically, whether you have freshwater wetlands or not, letters of interpretation. Basically, that is ground truthing by the department a delineation that was performed, in some instances, by a party to say the extent of the wetlands. That line and associated buffers with those wetlands identify the regulated areas. Why is that important to know? Because as part as you're doing the remediation, you'll need to know whether you need to engage land use. And as part of your remedy selection, there may be areas within those regulated areas that the remedial selection is not going to disturb them. Well, if you stay out of them, you don't need permits. There's 4 types. Basic presence absence, obviously, is it there or not? Presence absence for a proposed footprint, that's for a limited area within a larger site that you can look to see. Delineation on a property of less than an acre, this is an instance where the department gets involved and goes out and conducts the delineation of the wetlands for the party. Then there's line verification where you have a professional such as going out to the site and delineating the extent of the wetlands. Then we go out and verify that that line is correct. All types are valid for 5 years and 1 5-year reissuance extension. One thing I just want to touch on, for those of you who have been watching some of the legislative changes, there was the Permit Extension Act. The website is not up yet, but there will be a Permit Extension Act website that I would encourage, and again, we'll talk about our website and our listserv. It's something that SRP may also want to share with you when it gets live, where you can go. And a lot of the information in the past with land use has come to land use, and we write a letter. You get an extension. Your permit's been extended. That won't happen in the future. It'll be reliance on the website and the guidance on it. What was the ISRA? LNAs? No. LNAs? Okay. Remember with the LNAs we used to have, I'm sorry, it's been 2 years. I keep saying LOIs when I do that. Remember the LNAs that we used to have letters of non-applicability you could submit to the department? There was a point where we said, no, we're not issuing them anymore. Esteemed councils, review them. You make the call. You advise your clients. We don't issue those letters anymore. I know. It's all good. Well, it's all based on resources and other factors. Next slide, please. So keep your eyes open, and we'll try to get that on the Permit Extension Act. Flood hazard area. Oh, by the way, LOIs, there's a fee associated with that. So you got to pay a fee for us to do that. But pretty cool. Flood hazard area applicability determinations, whether the activity that's being proposed is within the flood hazard areas or affected riparian zones. And waterfront development, whether or not you're subject to waterfront development CAFRA, there's no fee. I'll show you how you get these. Next slide, please. Pre-application meetings. This is something that wasn't embraced in the past, not because they didn't feel that it was valuable. Prior to me getting over there, I think, and Scott, you were probably there during some of the tenure, the volume of work that was coming into land use was overwhelming. They could not manage the amount of work, and certain things had to go. And pre-application meetings, which they'd meet with parties to discuss their projects, the resources being impacted, and give them some guidance, they had to give that up because they just didn't have the staff to handle the volume. Well, under the economic downturn, and I think this is a very effective tool because I'm hoping this will increase the quality of what comes in, we've reinstituted it. So I would encourage you, again, these single individual practitioners, if you need a pre-application meeting, request it, engage Suzanne. She'll give you her number later. Those of you that have other projects which have substantial impacts and you need to have a pre-application meeting with the department, again, I would encourage to do it. It's not a painful process. There's certain things we'll ask you to bring so we can have an educated discussion, but again, it'll help you through the process. What I was trying to get to this on redevelopment sites, I want you to work together. Reality is full disclosure, tell me it is what your overall project is. Where do you want to go? Don't piecemeal it to me because all that does is make it painful for us. When I say that from a redevelopment component, from an SRP component, you know the extent of the contamination. You know what the remedy is and why you need to impact those resources. Things that I touched on earlier, some of the discussions that you could have is mitigation and understanding what you're proposing in your remedial action, whether it's from zero net fill, impacts to the riparian zone, mitigation under flood hazard, to wetland impacts to freshwater wetland, wetland impacts under Freshwater Wetlands Act. Both of those have money for your clients. Both of those, there's a cost associated with them to a resource and also for mitigation of those impacts. Not everything has to be mitigated. We have that outlined. There's certain activities that you can do within these regulated areas that don't require mitigation. But for remediation, if you're impacting those resources, there is going to need to be mitigation. With that said, one of the things that we are trying to, and we are continuing to discuss, and we're implementing it, is understanding the environmental net benefit of remediating an abandoned site that hasn't, nor has any future intent of being redeveloped or cleaned up, and the benefits of having that done, and then recognizing, okay, there is a resource being impacted, but maybe we can lower the standard to what the statute allows, not our regulations, to allow it. It's been effective, I think, but I understand that it also is trying to lessen the impacts of the deterrent of impacting those resources that have to be impacted. Foundation, I keep going back to when looking at resources, land use operates from a premise of avoid. Our regulations and our statutes do. Avoid. If you can't avoid, minimize, and then ultimately mitigate. Avoid, just so you know from an LSRP's perspective, that doesn't mean I got bad contamination out in the wetlands. I have to leave them there. Not at all. What you need to do is demonstrate I need to impact those resources because the contamination is at such a level that it's detrimental to the environment and human health. I had an interesting discussion with someone just the other day. It was a side note, walked up to me and said, you know, I got this great project, this great mitigation project. And you know what? This thing is great. And that's going to allow me to impact those resources. And I said, no, it's not. From a land use perspective, and I think you need to understand this, you need to demonstrate why you have to impact that resource. Once you demonstrate the need to impact it, then that really cool mitigation project, we'd love to address those impacts. But it's not, look what I can do so I can impact it. It's, it needs to be impacted, and this is what we will do to replace that impact. Simple concept, but sometimes gets lost with people that I talk to. Next slide, please. New and improved website. I have to give kudos painful, but I have to give kudos to Tessie Fields. Oh, it's hurting me. Just kidding. When I was over at site remediation, I remember on our website, Tessie came up with something, and with others within the site remediation program, is quick reference guides. A way to navigate through the regulations and processes that we had. And I know we've got to get updated, but to me, when 2 years ago I was there, it was a way that I could go to something, push a button, and it would take me where I wanted to go. I didn't have to pull up a regulation and start reading and reading and reading. It jumped me there. So what we did in our website is we tried to take that idea and build it a little better. Interesting enough, in preparation of this presentation, our new website, which is out there now, and that's the website address, I started to look at what we have for site remediation and for the LSRPs. And what I'm hoping to do in the next few months is not just make it better, but make it a lot better. The presentation that I'm giving you today, interesting enough, one of the people that worked for me, I gave him the presentation and I said, I'm going to go give this. He goes, you know what? I could take that and turn it into a web link. And he created a whole little web menu-driven thing to go through this presentation, which I thought was cool. But if you can do that, well, then give me a lot more information that I can assist the LSRPs and the practitioners to work through the process. So we're going to do that. We do have a listserv on it. Go to the next slide, please. This is a picture of, I have to admit, I don't like the picture up top, but somebody else picked it, so I had to do it. Let me see if I can get my pointer going here. I'm a button guy. If you know, anybody knows me, I push people's buttons, but I'm not the smartest one around, so I need something simple that I can jump to. You can write a bunch of text. I don't have time to read tons of text. I want to go to somewhere and I want to hit a button and take me. So, by the way, there's going to be more buttons here. But basically, this is the front page of our website that you'll see. There's a contact page. There's information and suggestions on this form. When you link to that, we have individuals within our office, and I would encourage all of you, go to our website. It's new. See if it works for you. If it doesn't work for you, or even if it does work for you, let us know. I want to improve it. This isn't there for me. This is there for you, especially the practitioners when I get to the next one. On here, there's hot topics. I just like that little burning button. This one here says, before you buy or build. In other words, this is how, oh, cool, look at that. That's pretty good, Jeff. That button there is the one with jurisdictional determinations. When you have a site, what do you need to do? How do I approach it? It'll give you information, it'll give you links to regulations and processes that you need to know. The next one, which is the permitting process. It gives you an overview of the permitting process. It's good information. Read it once, know it, and refresh yourself every 6 months to a year. Next one, common project types. This one's a cool button. I don't have this active, but that cool button, basically it gives you a list of types of projects that we deal with. There's one there that says contaminated sites and landfills. When you bring that up and you click on that, it'll take you to the next slide. And then the other one is application status, which will take you to, what's the name of it? Data miner, and you can find the application status of your project. On this side, right here, subscribe to an e-newsletter. That will be a button here that says listserv. I would like and encourage all of you to sign up on the listserv. Anything we change on the system, it'll get sent to you. You can delete it, but at least you know something happened. There's guidance that we'll be putting up. You'll get it. You don't want to read it, you can delete it. Next slide, please. This is, remember I said if you go to what types of projects, and it gave you a menu, and it would give you remediation of contaminated sites and landfills. What this is it basically gives you an overview. We're going to beef this up. This links to the various program websites. There's the SRP website, that's Solid and Hazardous Waste website. It also identifies different key components within the permitting process. It takes you to the before you build. You go here and you say, I don't know what I'm going to do. It'll take you to the jurisdictional determinations and pre-application meetings. It also then, as you go across here, this is freshwater wetlands. You click on it, it'll tell you if you're remediating a contaminated site, I need a GP4. It won't just tell you need a GP4, it'll pop you to the application, it'll pop you to the regulations, and it'll show you why. The same with flood hazard, coastal, and tidelands. It'll say whether or not there are jurisdictional areas or give you a little more insight on your specific site. Again, I'm dealing more with the individuals of you who are LSRPs, that don't have a land use group. It's written in such a fashion that I'm hoping the layperson can understand, because that's me, and I needed to understand it. This is one little field, but this is the one that I think you as LSRPs would need to key on. There's some great information. I'd love your feedback on it. If you go back to the previous slide, we've got that contact. Click on it. Give us your feedback. If there's information you think you need that we don't have on there, please let us know. Next slide, next slide. I'm almost done, guys. When should I engage, when should an LSRP engage land use? Well, guess what? Early. Unless you know what you're doing, and that's fine. Who should you get? There's one point that you deal with as an LSRP for site remediation land use permitting, and that's Suzanne Dietrich. I put especially redevelopment projects because, as you may hear in some case studies, these come with more challenges than most just standard remediations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Nice. Oh, I said early again. When should I identify the resources on my site when I'm doing an investigation? Obviously, early. Jurisdictional determination, information available on the website to assist you. Suzanne will speak about some case studies and how that can and cannot assist you. Select a remedy with limited to no impact to resources. Does that mean I can't remediate the site because I'm impacting wetlands? Not at all. If the wetlands need to be impacted because they're contaminated to an extent that it's warranted, yes, you will. Absolutely. And if anybody tells you differently, you call me. By the way, my number is 984-3444. Remember, avoid, mitigate, minimize, mitigate. That little story I told you about, hey, I got a great mitigation project. Well, that's wonderful, but you got to show why you need to impact that resource. And again, as I started and I'm ending, engage the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology early on if you need them. They're a resource, utilize them. Suzanne's probably going to tell me after this that she needs more staff. Next slide. Yeah, I know. With that, if I may, do you want me to introduce her, or do you want to?
No, we're going to take some questions.
Okay.
All right, questions. Anybody in the room? One, Roger.
Mark, you talk about identifying resources only, or early, excuse me. Do you equate that identification of resources the same as the site remediation? You would identify your sensitive receptors back in that day? Are we talking about the same things, or are you talking about the applicability determinations, or both?
I'm saying the same thing plus more. Again, when you're doing the ecological evaluation, there's also regulatory. When I say resources, I just tried to use a generic word to say regulated area, land use has jurisdiction, not regulated area. So jurisdictional determinations and identifying the resources, you're getting part of that, but there's also, I may acquire a site that I now find out, okay, there's no wetlands on it, but there's no riparian zone, but I'm in the flood hazard area. It's a non-tidal stream. I have zero net fill. The remedy that I'm going to choose is I want to cap it with 2 foot of fill. Well, under regulations, you then need to show where you're eliminating 2 foot of fill within that same area. So what I'm saying is it's that plus a little more. What?
Waiver rule.
Yeah. As Suzanne said, if that came up, it may be eligible for a hardship waiver under the flood hazard rules. But again, need to know it to ask the questions.
Anybody else before Suzanne? All right, looks like she's up.
Okay, son. As some of you probably do realize already, the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology has been in existence since 1998. And we were originally formed, obviously, as the name says, to handle dredging and dredge material management in tidal waters of the state of New Jersey. What occurred quickly after that is when there was a need to do upland placement of dredge material in the New York, New Jersey harbor, we then got involved in the land use permitting of rather large brownfield sites, which some of you may be familiar with, Jersey Gardens Mall, Bayonne Golf Club, Port Reading Business Park. At that time, obviously with our experience in land use permitting, it was decided that in February of 2011, our office would take over all land use permitting of contaminated sites and landfill closures. As you can see, and if you look at the timeline, since February of 2011 was when, and you probably all, I hope, got the LSRP listserv, identifying our office as the contact person for land use permitting. From that time, from February 2011, we have issued 111 permits for contaminated sites or landfill closures. Of those permits, and I'll get into them a little bit more, it could be as simple as a GP to do monitoring wells and wetlands, or we have done a large number of 200 plus acre brownfields redevelopments. So you can see we ran the gamut. One of the things that actually came up this morning when in a discussion with an LSRP, the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology has been fully trained in all of the site remediation new regulations, the technical requirements for site remediation, ARCs. So we have, as been alluded to, a full understanding of the requirements of what the LSRP is now undertaking on those sites. With that, what we are learning at the same time that the LSRP is navigating through all the new regs and how to implement remedies on contaminated sites, as you are learning, we are learning, and I will point out in upcoming slides where within the last year we have already made some changes to how we regulate activities on contaminated sites based on some information and feedback that we've actually gotten from LSRPs over the last year. While there's a lot of information on this slide, I want to go through kind of each individual GP that may apply to a particular activity that an LSRP may be undertaking on a contaminated site or a landfill. Obviously, the first would be when you're proceeding with an RI investigation. GP 12, which some of you probably have gotten when you've done soil borings in freshwater wetlands or state open waters. This GP, as it's indicating, is for when you're doing a hand auger, when you are digging soil borings by machine, as well as if you're doing some vegetative clearing for survey lines. With that said, as Mark alluded to, even within the freshwater wetland regulations, there are activities that if, for example, if you were doing hand borings that are less than 3 feet in diameter and depth, you do not need DEP approval to do that activity. There is nothing that you would get from the land use regulation program to do that. Again, same thing, if you were cutting vegetation by a machine and your width is no wider than 5 feet, you do not need a permit. I'm reading these are directly from the regs. I realize it's kind of cumbersome, but what this is reflecting is that there's certain situations, even with the GP12 and doing your soil borings for RI work, where we would not issue you a permit at all. And again, I encourage you to go onto the web page, click right on to soil borings, and it will bring you right to the GP12, which will show you exactly what we exempt, and you would not need a permit from us. The other GP14 is also used for installing monitoring wells, temporary or permanent, in freshwater wetlands. A lot of the times it was recognized that when you guys are evaluating a groundwater plume on a contaminated site, you may not know the extent or the vertical or the area that you're trying to navigate to determine that groundwater plume. So one of the options that is available is a blanket approval under the GP14. We issue you the permit to do the monitoring wells, and then at a later date, once you've installed those wells, you're coming back into the department just with a map that shows us where you put those monitoring wells. A lot of the times, there are, as I said, there are limitations under the GP12 and the 14 as to what we can cover. There, at that point, in some instances, we've actually authorized investigative work under a GP4. And that is when, as it's alluding to, the scope of your work is just beyond what those two GPs should be able to handle. As you move into the waterfront development and CAFRA permit, CAFRA zone, we have a CAFRA GP15 that covers pretty much any proposed investigative work that you're doing within, from the knee-high water line landward. Very distinct GP that handles that type of activity for RI work. That same permit is done when you're implementing a remedy in the waterfront development area. The other one, which quite frankly, being in the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology, we were surprised to realize there was a GP, was a GP27, and as it's alluding to, it's basically taking soil borings in a water area of a tidal water body. Obviously over for a rather extensive period of time, anybody doing a dredging project was sampling the dredge material for purposes of our waterfront development permit. This was basically saying that all of those projects should have gotten a CAFRA GP27. As it's alluding to there, the first thing that we did when we realized this was that we had this changed to a permit by rule in the new CZM rules, because we just did not think that it was efficient to require a permit for taking samples off the back of a boat when there's minimum environmental impact from doing that activity. Under flood hazard area, and quite frankly, this particular rule still requires individual flood hazard permits for activities that are undertaken within the floodway, flood fringe, or riparian zone. Under your RI work, depending upon the amount of vegetation that you may have to clear in these areas to implement your RI work, an individual flood hazard permit may also be required. Next slide. Next slide. As you're moving through your remedial action, this is where I think we have really taken on making some changes to how we are working with the LSRP in getting the permits issued and some of the items within the regulations that we have seen as a concern. Probably all familiar with the freshwater wetlands GP4, which is if you're undertaking a remedial action in a freshwater wetlands or state open water, you would be required to get a GP4. One of the things that has come up on a repeated basis is, and it's a question that we get from the LSRPs all the time, is under a GP4, if you're implementing an RI work plan, in the past, the site remediation program used to issue approvals for the work plans, and that was our basis for issuing a GP4 for RI work. The LSRPs are no longer required to file the remedial action work plan under the new regs. And I think I was hoping the gentleman was here, one of the recommendations of one of the LSRPs when we ran into this situation in a permit was that, well, I would like to be able, as the LSRP, to write a letter as part of the land use application and say, we are going to implement this work plan. Here's our scope of work. And that's what we were able to use as our approval under the GP4. And I'll get into that a little bit more as to some of the nuances that exist under the GP4. As with both all GPs, again, if there is any sort of impact from your remediation, there is a mitigation component that is going to need to be implemented, and it has to come in with your permit application that you have a mitigation plan that you are going to implement in order for us to issue you that GP4. Very important. As Mark stressed, that's the reason for coming in to speak with us early so that you understand what is going to be required as you move through your process. The next permit that was specifically established for landfill closures, and it has its own nuances also, is in that permit there is an approval that is required from the Division of Solid and Hazardous Waste, or in the case of site remediation, we're actually looking for an approval from the Office of Brownfields Redevelopment. Some of you may be familiar with Tim Bartle. So in that case, that permit requires also that either an LSRP or someone from the Division of Solid and Hazardous Waste is issuing an approval. One of the nuances of that landfill closure permit is that any wetlands that are present on the top of the landfill or along the slope of the landfill that are necessary to be impacted to properly cap that landfill, mitigation is not required for those impacts. It's very clear in the regulations as to what we cover, what mitigation is required under those types of activities. If, as Mark alluded to, the acreage of impact that is proposed to implement your remedy, and generally speaking, we've been using kind of as you get above 5 acres of freshwater wetland impacts or state open waters, we are having people move toward an individual freshwater wetlands permit. That is not to say that the permit to implement the remedy will not be issued. It's just because of the fact, and I'll get into this a little bit further, because of the fact that there's other agencies that may be involved in reviewing that permit, and a lot of the times those agencies being U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which some of you may run into, they are asking for a higher level of alternative analysis in implementing your remedy, and this is a way through the individual freshwater wetlands permit to get at that coordination between the federal agencies. What this 5-acre trigger is alluding to is when the state of New Jersey took over the freshwater wetlands program from the federal agencies, if more than 5 acres of freshwater wetlands are going to be impacted, we need to make sure that EPA concurs with that impact before we can move forward with the issuance of our own permits. It's a very rigorous process, is the best way to describe it, and it's there for a reason, because 5 acres in everybody's mind should be, that's a significant impact of freshwater wetlands as you're implementing a remedy. And I'll get into a little bit more in the case studies of why the LSRP in some cases will be brought into those discussions with the federal agencies, and that, again, as Mark's alluding to, instead of doing it on the back end when you're trying to implement your remedy, it may be beneficial as you're going through your RI investigation to engage the federal agencies as you're seeing that your impacts are going to be something that they're going to be wanting to look at.
Suzanne,
Yes.
before you go further, RAWs have to be submitted. We just don't approve them.
Understood.
So
Understood.
make sure that they,
Okay.
because I think you said they are.
Yeah, I guess what we're saying is that, well, I was saying that the Division of Solid and Hazardous Waste still has to approve a closure plan, but the LSRPs are the ones that are actually approving the remedial action work plan. And that's what we are using as our approval to allow us to issue the permits. Under waterfront development, same, and they look very familiar. CAFRA GP15 is also used to implement any sort of remediation above the mean high water line. And if for some reason you have to go into the water to do a sediment remediation because of the contamination on the site has moved into an adjacent water body, tidal water body, the individual waterfront development permit would be what we would issue. CAFRA jurisdictional area is also in waterfront. Again, unfortunately, the individual flood hazard area permit is an individual. There are no GPs at this time for cleanups to be done under a GP. So that it's what you can see. Two things that I wanted to stress that we did do is that in the new regulations, we did develop a GP specifically for the cleanups, and they mirror the CAFRA GP15, the freshwater wetlands GP4, and the freshwater wetlands GP5. So with the new regs in 2013, instead of having to go through an individual flood hazard area permit, we would be able to issue a GP. The other thing that was coming up time and time again on the flood hazard area permits, and some of you may have been familiar with it or run into this, is the riparian zone compensation. If at any point when you're implementing a remedy, you have to clear the vegetation in a riparian zone, the existing flood hazard regulations require you to mitigate for that impact at a 2-to-1 ratio. This was proving rather difficult on some of the contaminated sites because there was a lot of area that you could actually do 2-to-1 if there were other aspects of the site that were either already redeveloped or there just wasn't enough space to plant that many trees. What we did do is we dropped that ratio down to 1-to-1 for contaminated sites, and as Mark's alluding to, the way that the policy was written is that we're recognizing that what you're implementing is an environmental benefit so that we could allow for a lesser ratio than the 2-to-1 that is in the regulation. So this is already as a policy, and it's being implemented into the new freshwater wetland regs. Next slide, please. Flood hazard regs. Again, this is, I can't stress this any more in that this is direct language under the GP4, and it is, I'll read the underline, undertaken by the department or expressly approved pursuant to the administrative requirements for remediation of contaminated sites. What that is saying is that when we receive a land use permit for remediation, we need, literally as an appendix or right behind it, the remedial action work plan certification form filed by the LSRP. Obviously, the backup large binders or whatever you want to call it is going into the initial notice. We just need the certification form. That is serving as our compliance with this section of the GP4 to allow you to implement the remedy. That may sound like a very simple activity, but over the last year we have gotten a lot of land use permits, GP4s, where we have had to go back through the applicant to get the LSRP to file a remedial action work plan, and then they give us the certification form. So, and as this is indicating, similar language is in the GP5 and the GP15. So just keep, one of the things, if that's a takeaway, it's one of the things that can help move those permit applications through faster. If that is just slid right into the back, if we need to look at the remedial action work plan, we will go within our program and pull that document down ourselves. Next slide. What I'd like to do at this point is just to help kind of get you to see what some of the information that over the last year we have found has been deficient and that we've had to go back again through the applicant to get information from the LSRP. Not really going to, some of the projects are rather lengthy, so, but I want to just kind of describe them in some detail. Again, a hand auger of soil borings, it did meet the threshold of the GP 12 of 3 feet or more in diameter, and they were also doing temporary wells in an area adjacent to the AOCs and freshwater wetlands. This particular case study was authorized under a GP 12 and 14. What we need from the LSRP, and it's usually part of an RI work plan, is the actual plan that shows where your borings are going to be located, and if you can, where your well locations are going to be located. Land use permits are construction permits. They're based on issuing an approved plan. Every one of our permits references a plan. That's what we need from the LSRP in order to issue this particular permit. Next slide. This RI investigation was a little more involved. As you can see, a number of borings had to be dug by machine. They were cutting the vegetation. They were doing temporary access roads across streams to get to another area where there was an AOC. We did not qualify this under a GP. We felt it did not meet that threshold level. In this case, as I alluded to, we issued it under a GP4, and because there was a crossing of a stream, it also needed to obtain an individual flood hazard permit for the activity. In this particular case, because they did not exactly know where their monitoring wells were going to be placed, we issued a blanket approval, and they'll be coming back in the coming years with a plan as part of the compliance statement with their permits. Again, a little nuance here is that with the RIs no longer being approved, as I said before, we actually got a letter from the LSRP, and he actually did submit the scope of work, and that went into our permit file that allowed us to issue this particular permit. The other thing that also had to occur here is, as with most of these GPs, if you're going in and impacting a resource, as you're pulling back out, obviously we're going to need to see some form of a restoration plan, and in this case, because they were along a stream, we also needed to see some sort of riparian zone restoration when the project was completed. So that is an actual plan that comes in with the application to show when I'm done, this is the planning that I will be putting in this particular area to comply with the regulations. This is the project that was done in Middlesex County. In this case, it was the remediation and restoration of unnamed tributary. The contamination in this case was a underground storage tank that had leaked and made its way to the unnamed tributary. The disturbances aren't necessarily of any importance except to say that, again, as with land use permits, we need to understand exactly what your temporary impacts are to implement your remedy, as well as your permanent impacts to implement a certain remedy, so that we can properly evaluate what your mitigation requirements will be to implement this particular remedy. In this case, because it was a remedial action, we were asking for the remedial action work plan certification form. One of the things also that did come up here is that because they were doing a remedy in a stream, and it also brought up some issues with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, there was a question as to whether or not the proper baseline ecological assessment had been performed or an ecological receptor evaluation had been performed on this particular project. So again, it's very important that you establish, as you're going through, you're implementing a remedy on a contaminated site, that you're doing all the necessary filings as required by the SRP regs. It helps us so that we can very quickly point to those documents that you have gone through the necessary regulatory process. Again, here, and it may sound strange, but we were requiring a development plan as to how the remedy would be implemented, as well as their mitigation and their restoration plan. Interestingly, this particular RP actually took on a additional, wasn't even part of the remediation. They actually removed a a culvert that was actually constricting flow. So in this case, for purposes beyond the remediation, he actually helped out flood hazard issues in this particular unnamed tributary by removing this particular culvert. Relatively simple process, project to permit. Next slide. Okay. As noted, this particular project application is still pending with the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology, and I think it's a good tool for the LSRPs to understand some of the issues that do come up when trying to implement a remedy. Again, former landfill, it was remediation and redevelopment of that landfill. It was not registered under the Division of Solid and Hazardous Waste. Installation of a cap consisting of landscape areas as well as building footprint and parking lot. And because there was a redevelopment, they were also required to comply with our stormwater management regs that went into, I don't know when they went into play, four or 5 years ago. Again, and I can say quite frankly, there was absolutely limited pre-application meetings prior to filing of this application. One of the very important things that kept coming up even during the permit review process was whether or not this particular site fell under flood hazard jurisdiction. It ultimately, I guess, one aspect of it was found to be under flood hazard jurisdiction from a large tidal water body, but there were a number of ditches that went around the landfill that is still under discussion as to whether or not riparian zone applies to the project. In this case, there was absolutely no remedial action work plan certification form filed, and also no remedial action work plan filed within initial notice of site remediation. As we got into, and Mark alluded to this, as we got into a more formal review of what had been provided in our application, in the land use applications, we did a quasi-component review of what had been provided through our permit application, and it was found that it was an incomplete RI investigation. And as I alluded to, there was no baseline ecological assessment, and there had not been a proper ecological receptor evaluation under the new regulations. Lastly, at the time that the application was submitted, the stormwater management regulations had not been addressed. We are working through this application, trying to get it to work. It is a rather important project in that it is a warehouse in the Port District, and it is something that, being in the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology and regulating port projects, we support. But again, can't stress it more, you need to go through the incremental process under the SRP regs to allow us to be able to justify the impacts and that it complies with ARCs and complies with the technical requirements for site remediation so that we can move through our process rather smoothly. Next slide. A lot of write-up here. This, I guess it's also to demonstrate here that this is one of our larger brownfields redevelopment sites. It's 190 acre former industrial facility, rather extensive remediation here. We're ringing the entire site with a hydraulic containment system, approximately 69 acres in circumference. There's capping of the site, as well as there's installation of groundwater extraction treatment system, and there's a mitigation component, obviously, with 25 acres of wetland fill, as well as 6 acres of state open water, and some other impacts to resources. Again, in this particular case, it was authorized under a freshwater wetlands individual permit because of the size of the impact. Flood hazard came into play, as well as, I also did not put up there, I believe waterfront development came into play on this particular project too. And then there were GPs for public access activities that were done in the mitigation area. What was interesting here is that, again, because of the acreage being more than 5 acres. This application went to EPA, 5 acres, went up to EPA for their review and their concurrence with the impacts. As you can see, the timeline on this thing was that it actually received an SRP, Remedial Action Work Plan approval, from our program before the LSRP program went into effect. With that said, when the time came and the land use permits were submitted to the department, both the Site Remediation Program Project Manager and the LSRP and their technical team supporting that were present at the discussions with the federal agencies justifying the impacts, explaining why there was a need for a hydraulic barrier system versus removal of a large volume of that contaminated material. So just keep that in mind, that while in some cases there may have been a previous approval by the department, as you come in through the land use permitting, you may be pulled back into a technical discussion on numerous fronts. The other thing that also came out of this particular project that the LSRP was involved in is he developed the material acceptance plan, as some of you kind of, I believe, are getting into as with these larger brownfield sites. And he's also the responsible party overseeing the import of the fill, as well as the fill being used for the remedy, as well as the fill to be used for the mitigation site. I can tell you this is probably one of our signature projects in the last year because while it is a large volume of freshwater wetlands impacts, the applicant took the time and the energy to clearly understand what was going on in the community, and what the community wanted was on-site mitigation, not going to a bank somewhere else in the region. And the applicant, or in this case it was actually the responsible party, it was not a brownfields redeveloper, it was the RP that they were working with. I can't say enough about this project being one of our highlights in the last year. Next slide, please. This is just another one, was covered under talk a little bit about the freshwater wetlands GP5, former sanitary landfill, a compaction of on-site soils, and then it was going to be redeveloped into a parking lot, which also, again, has its own stormwater management component. Not necessarily, again, impacts pretty straightforward, but they are needed to be documented in the application. This was authorized under the GP5. The LSRP involvement was the same as a remedial action. We would be looking for the certification form. Added component here is that there was a need to obtain through the Office of Brownfields Redevelopment the landfill closure, landfill disruption, landfill closure plan from specifically Tim Bartle before we could move forward with the issuance of our permits. That last slide is rather interesting. I can tell you, after working in dredging for at least a decade, we were very familiar with timing restrictions associated with winter flounder, striped bass, blue crab. As we, and I'll use the term, came out of the water, we realized that there's a large T&E species that have very significant timing restrictions as to when certain activities can happen within the state. This particular one was the Indiana bat, which limits clearing in the springtime, which is obviously when a lot of people would love to get in and clear the trees for their implement their remedy. So something to keep in mind. And again, as you come in for any pre-apps, there are lists that and overlays even on the GeoWeb. You can get an idea if you're dealing with a threatened endangered species on land as you're implementing a remedy. Just to keep that in mind, I can say that kind of knocked us for a loop trying to learn where some of these species are of concern. Next slide. This kind of to reiterate a lot of what I've been going through over the course of this presentation is the LSRP is responsible for all remedial activities and regulatory compliance. In both the ARCs and the technical requirements of site remediation, it has provisions which says any remedy that you implement has to comply with all applicable regulations of the state. We take that pretty strongly, and there's where we may be pushing back that some of the impacts may not be necessary to implement your remedy, and we were looking to work with you to minimize those impacts. And again, can't say it more, proper and timely filing of any of your required ARC documentations, and then once they're filed, all we need is just slid right into the land use application, and we are fine, that it shows that it's been filed. And as I said, be prepared to answer questions and some comments. We're kind of getting to know all the different LSRPs that are on the different sites, and we will be at times coming back and asking you some questions as follow-up to what you have submitted through site remediation program. And again, as Mark's kind of alluding to, as you're implementing your remedy, be mindful of the fact that mitigation is a component for any impacts to natural resources under the land use regulations. And it may actually change the way you implement your strategy when you realize that there's a mitigation component to the activity. Next slide. That's us, rather long address, but that's, you guys all have it. That's where you can call to contact our office. Next slide. Just want to introduce this office was, again, created back in 1998, and we split out the areas of dredging and dredging material managed by counties. So what we have done is each staff member is given a specific county, and yes, they are direct lines to those people. We've been doing that since 1998, and that's not going to change. It's not on there?
There's
oof.
nothing in Atlantic.
There's no contamination in Atlantic. There's no contamination in Atlantic County. It's Mark Davis. I'm sorry, Mark Davis. We will add that on. And I can say, phenomenal group of guys that I work with. All of them, with the exception of Gary, have over 20 years of experience, multifaceted, land use, water quality, or actually case of Mark Davis, he actually did sludge, so that's how he got into the dredging world. But these gentlemen are all available to have pre-application meetings. The other thing I would offer, and we've done this on a number of occasions, is through the technical requirements for site remediation, LSRPs can do consultations with BICRA on different projects. Is that how it's pronounced? BICRA. I know, they're might be 2 steps away from my door. But with that said, we have been requested to attend those type of technical consultations to interject some of the land use issues that may come up through that, implementing that remedy. And that's actually proven pretty effective as you guys are kind of moving forward. Next slide. I'd be remiss, and anybody who knows me, obviously, we have a large volume of dredge material that is moved out of the federal navigation channels in North Jersey, or it is in upland confined disposal facilities on the Delaware River. We need to move it. We will be pushing you through your material acceptance plans as you're developing them to see if you can incorporate either processed dredge material or dredge material in implementing your remedy. So there was an ulterior motive in taking on these remediation projects because, again, we have some volume that we need to get out to renew capacity in some of these locations. Next slide. There you go. Do we have to stand up here?
If there's any questions, we have questions from the audience here. Hold on.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, how you doing?
I had a question. A number of projects, remediation projects, can be very complex and require a number of years of investigation. Multiple times going out into a site that may impact regulated areas, the same areas, more than once. I've been involved with a number of projects where they, I guess over the course of a couple years, even would need to kind of go out and access through an area multiple times. For mitigation, I guess, for riparian zone or wetland impacts that were associated with trees, then they need to come back. They need to restore and plant trees, as part of that restoration, even at a 1-to-1 ratio. In the past, they've allowed, I guess, to put off that restoration till the very, very end of the investigation and then the actual remediation after, the investigation process. Is that something that is still being allowed, I guess, to sort of like tally it up, as you go and then do it all at the end?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, impacts under an RI, as you're proceeding through that RI, most of the time, the other thing that we do is that you may...
Really?
Okay. You may start with an RI plan that says this is where, the soil borings are, this is where your groundwater monitoring wells are going to be. Obviously, we recognize that as you start through that, you may find that the AOC has further contamination out. And you need to go through it and go back. What we have been doing is modifications of the existing permits that we've issued for RI investigations to allow you to do that impact, additional impact. I would say historically 12, 14 is when you have a really good idea of what you're doing. GP4 is the one that I would recommend as your kind of, if you still have to advance over an area for an extended period of time. And you can keep modifying it. And certainly we understand that there's going to be a need to potentially put off, and in some cases we have allowed a statement that once you're done your RI, the area may naturally restore itself. We've allowed that to also happen at times.
All right, there's a big question here, so bear with us. This pertains to letters of intent. Okay, number 1. It gives the citation at 7.7a. It says that you must provide a line delineation or verification letter of intent. Then it says that if no such letter of intent has been issued, you must provide DEP with information for the LOI delineation or verification. Can you please explain why you would ever not get the LOI before you apply for the permit? And the answer is, I don't know, right? What's the answer?
Well, let me see if I can replicate that. I don't know.
You should.
I'm sort of reaching here because it doesn't make sense to me.
All right.
You're coming in for a permit, you need to know the extent of the resources that you have.
Right, and you would need that LOI to do that effectively.
And if you want, we can research this question and I can...
You can always call Mark. Okay. The second part of this would be...
Thanks, Tess.
Huh?
Thank you.
Anytime. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will issue their own letters of interpretation identifying wetlands regulated under the Clean Water Act. How will DEP treat such a letter, particularly in light of the fact that New Jersey has assumed responsibility for the federal wetlands program, and can it be used at all in the application for a DEP LOI? A federal letter. They're talking about a federal Army Corps of Engineers letter of interpretation.
Army Corps is independent jurisdiction over Act.
They're saying, would you do anything with that letter? I think is what she's asking.
In most cases, the Army Corps of Engineers and the DEP would try to come up with similar jurisdictions, letters of interpretation. We both go out in the field if there's dual jurisdiction in that nature.
So the answer is yes, we would work with the engineer. Okay, I'm going to go on to somebody else. For soil borings above the mean high water line, do I need a CAFRA GP 15?
Yes.
Yes. Anybody else in the room? We have, hold on.
I need water.
You need the GP 15 for how far off the water?
Mean
off
high
that
water
line?
line to 5,
Go back into the site, if you're only doing
Understood.
100
Okay.
feet from the water.
it's the mean high water line 500 feet back or the first intervening public roadway.
All right, did everybody get that? Okay. All right, we have a
Okay.
question back here. Hold on.
Yeah, they're about.
Hold on.
Sorry. I was wondering, for the soil borings above the mean high water line, can they also be authorized by the GP 27?
The GP 27 is specifically for below the mean high water line.
Is that with the new regs, or?
The new reg is the permit by rule is just addressing any investigation in the water.
Okay, anybody else in the room? All right, hold on.
Suzanne, you did a nice job outlining what's needed as far as from the LSRP approval perspective on remedial investigation work plans or RA work plans. For smaller things such as, you're 99% done with your RI, you've got a few more borings and maybe another well to kind of help define your remedial action selection, something that would be covered in like a pre-design investigation. Things that would typically be handled by the case manager, a phone call, an email approving it. What do you need from an LSRP in those situations? A site plan and a letter kind of thing?
If you're looking, I guess if you've been issued a permit already to do RI work, and again, you're trying to expand that a little bit just to complete your work, it could be done under a modification of the GP4.
Okay, if you didn't have a permit yet and you were now moving into a wetland area to take,
You would
You know-
need to come in and get a GP12 or a GP14. If you,
understood, but what would you need from the LSRP as far as approval of an SRP type document?
again, if you're doing an RI, all I really need is a plan.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay, let's go back to our web friends. Is a draft of the new flood hazard rules, are they available? How can I get a copy?
No, they're
No.
not currently available. They will be. If you remember on my presentation, I gave a date approximately.
You said
when-
December or January?
Yes, the
Are you
flood
being
hazard,
optimistic?
I believe we were looking for getting out the proposal in January for the flood hazard rules. Those that were involved in the stakeholder process may have gotten components of rules that they were specifically involved in, but that will not be available until it gets through the standard rule
Right,
process.
right, so then it'll be available open for public comment at that
And we'll
time.
have links on our websites.
Yep. All righty, who accepts and administratively processes the individual FHA applications for remediation?
Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology.
Suzanne, she's going to be so popular.
I guess
after this.
just to also clarify, hi Nick, how you doing?
Don't answer that.
What does occur is that the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology is the one that's actually processing the applications, but we work with the land use engineers, and they actually review the application from an engineering standpoint. But we are the office that is kind of accepting and administratively processing the applications.
So submitted to you.
Yeah.
To Suzanne's office. Okay. Regs and current DEP SRP policy does not require submission of a RIWP, and there are no forms for submission of the certification of those plans. What form are you referring to? I don't think she said form.
No.
Oh, well, you did say they have to certify.
Yeah, for an RIWP, there is not a certification or a filing required under the technical requirements for site remediation.
You
or
want a
ARCs.
letter that says it?
And what we were accepting was a letter from the LSRP saying we are going to implement this remedial action work plan. This is the plan that shows where this is all going to happen, and that's what we are working with.
Suzanne, I think they're asking for another form.
No, we don't want to.
I think they are.
Your tongue.
All right. If you have uplands and wetlands and state open waters to be remediated, would it all be covered under the GP4, or would a GP4 be needed for wetlands and additionally a GP13 for dredging?
If they are doing a remediation in the uplands and it's not in flood hazard, waterfront, or CAFRA, you don't need a permit at all. But wetlands, state open water, you would need a GP4. And I guess what this person's alluding to is that in some cases, a GP13 is being issued for lake dredging. And what we have unfortunately been finding is that some of the lakes that are dredged across the state have a contamination component to them that have necessitated hiring of an LSRP. And in that particular case, when the LSRP has been brought on to the particular project, we're covering it under a GP4.
That was complicated.
It
Okay.
is complicated.
Okay. Any more in the room? We have a question over here.
Suzanne, I have a question about mitigation plans. I didn't hear much about them today. They're very complicated. I've been doing them for a few years. And I just wanted, for the LSRP's sake, to let us know if there's any plans to change the 5-year monitoring requirements for forested wetlands, or if there's anything like that. I mean, they're really detailed, and we didn't hear much about them today, so I wanted to get your perspective on have mitigation plans changed.
If you don't, I'll take that one. The answer is no, they have not changed. When we go through and have some discussions over the freshwater wetlands rules, we'll be discussing mitigation plans, mitigation banking, ratios, a lot of that information. But at this point, nothing has been changed.
All right, from the web, will the new versions of the regs allow permits by rule authorization for RI activities in unvegetated wetland transition areas? No such thing. Don't even think about it. There's a lot of scrunching. For you guys on the web, there's a lot of scrunching of faces. Disturbed areas?
Yeah. Unvegetated wetland transition areas. I mean,
Is that mutually exclusive?
if you're doing work in a wetland transition area, you would need a permit. But
All right, we're going to move on.
He's talking about
Yeah.
wetlands rules. There's
Do-
no.
If they're not functioning as wetlands, then you could get a GP1 usually, and that automatically means you have your transition.
yeah.
All right, hold on,
Okay,
repeat that. Do you want
Let
to
me, let me clarify that just for a point. If we're talking about freshwater wetlands, we don't have a rule revision that's going to be put out for freshwater wetlands. That hasn't been stakeholdered yet. So the regulations we're talking about are, maybe this is under the riparian zone. I mean, clarification would be better. They may be talking about the riparian zone under flood hazard. Now we have, pardon me? And we do have in those rules, there is some recognition of areas that were actively disturbed and impacts that can occur within those areas without requiring mitigation. But again, that's something that when those rules come out through the process, people will have the opportunity to review and provide comments. So,
Okay.
but the freshwater wetlands rules, we are not, there's no proposal coming out in the foreseeable future.
Okay.
That still hasn't been stakeholdered.
All right. And I like how Mark changed a noun to a verb. We're going to stakeholder something. It's creative English. We like that. Okay. Not that one. Here. How do we make sure our submittals for remediation sites go to ODST? Can they do field meetings when delineation and resource assessment is substantially complete?
Yes, that would be actually when we would recommend coming in. That would serve as a pre-app for us to go on site and we can meet and take a look at what the remedy is going to be.
Okay, so if they want to submit something to you, they submit it directly to you, right?
Yeah.
And the things that go to Kirsten's shop through initial notice and all those things go there, and you guys have access to them, so you don't have to submit anything twice, right? You submit stuff to Suzanne that goes to Suzanne, stuff that goes.
Yeah, we are again under any filing that goes in to initial notice. We're not looking for the big binders. We're looking for the certification form that you have
Not
made.
form, certification letter,
Letter.
a letter that certifies that
No,
you've.
For the remedial action work plan, it would be the actual remedial action work plan certification form.
Okay, there is a form for that, not for
And
the
that
RI.
the RI would be a letter that, I know. You guys decided not to approve it.
GP12 application. Does that go to initial notice or does that go to?
No, it comes to us.
Any GP, anything.
Yes.
GP, if it starts with the G, it goes there. Okay. One or two more. We have a few more minutes. For environmental boring plans submitted for a freshwater wetlands GP12, for example, do all borings need to be shown or only those in regulated areas? Do you need to see the borings all over or just in the regulated areas?
I mean, ideally, at a minimum, the GP12, the ones that are in the regulated area, but there's no reason why, if you have an RI
Why
plan,
recreate a plan? Yeah.
just send us the whole thing.
Right, send the whole thing and make sure you have your zone, your regulated area delineated.
Point of clarification, we only permit what's in the regulated
Yeah.
areas.
Yeah.
Outside of it,
We don't regulate.
yes,
Okay,
under land use.
and they don't regulate anything outside that, but why create a second plan? Okay. Will there be better alignment between the Corps and the department's GPs as a part of upcoming rule provisions? Having to do with waterfront development application can be overkill. Having to do one of these can be overkill.
Yeah,
No, not under the current proposal. Sorry about that. Can we be put on a emailing list to get copies of the proposed coastal and FHA regs when they're put on the street? I think what you're going to do, give him the mic.
As I indicated, get on our listserv, which I showed where it was on our website. On the left side, it says being available to the e-newsletters. I think also, Tessie, we talked about maybe if it would be of benefit for the LSRPs when those regulations get out there, that we even put that announcement, maybe blast through the LSRP.
And we can also craft, when it really is an SRP and land use dual message, we can send it out to both listservs.
Yep.
And the LSRPA, we can always ask them to put stuff on their
So
webpage.
the answer is yes. Our intent is
Yes,
to
we
make
will.
sure everyone knows.
We're gonna get that out to everybody. Okay, almost done here. What is the basis for requiring two separate freshwater wetland GPs, 12 and 14, for environmental borings and monitoring well installations? Why can't they be combined into one GP?
I guess to clarify, the GP12 and the GP4 have allowances for other activities to happen that involve, for example, survey lines are covered under the GP12, and under the GP14 it's called water monitoring devices, one of which is a monitoring wells. So I actually agree with what she's saying. I'm just saying that's why the two GPs were separated, but we may be able to craft one GP that handles RI work that falls under those two type of components.
This comment should be discussed with stakeholders,
Yeah.
freshwater wetland rules.
I think they're going to write that down.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend the commoner keep an eye on the freshwater wetlands, again, through the listserv when that's out, and try and get onto the stakeholder group because that's actually not a bad idea.
Okay. Can I answer this one?
Yeah.
This next one, I would suggest accepting an RIWP and statement of approval from the LSRP as part of the land use permit filing project description, rather than forcing submission of documents to SRP beyond what the tech rules requires. And we never said that you should submit anything in addition, no documents in addition to what the tech rules or ARCS requires. But your permit application, you have to have your permit application of land use. All the supporting documentation is part of what you already have to submit. You don't have to do it twice. Thank you. All right. It is understood that the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology is processing applications and approving, but isn't there a DLUR mitigation unit still responsible for approving any restoration? If yes, should the mitigation unit staff be at pre-apps?
The answer is yes, they are. And although we have the Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology doing the land use permitting, Suzanne also relies on engineers within various areas of other bureaus to provide that information. So there's support functions the division still provides to her office, whether it be mitigation, engineering, and such.
Another question for
Two quick questions. Suzanne, do you want pre-app meetings on all projects or only ones that may have some difficulty?
Obviously, I would say that if you can handle filing the land use application without a pre-app, I don't feel it's necessary. But at any point, if you're hitting a sticking point as you're getting through those regulations and trying to file your application, then I would say come in and speak with us.
What about a redevelopment project where you
Absolutely.
got to go up front and get RI activity permits, but a year and a half from now you're going to be getting waterfront development permits and other permits? Does it help you to do it up front and have a...
If it's a
Okay.
redevelopment project, as Mark alluded to, you need to come in and talk with us about them.
Okay, and Mark, one quick question for you. The state owns the tidelands flowed after 1965 or something like that? 1800 and something. The state owns that, so if you have contaminated, previously flowed